The morning air in the lower stables of the Silver Keep tasted of frost, wet limestone, and the sharp tang of ammonia. Maeve Vance kept her gaze fixed on the uneven cobblestones, the bristles of her heavy broom rhythmically scraping against the frozen dirt. For a low-status groom, being utterly forgettable was the safest defense. Fragile, perhaps, but it demanded no strength to uphold. If she did not look up, she did not exist. If she did not exist, she could not be blamed for the disaster currently unfolding at the center of the royal mews. Master Julian Thorne, the newly appointed royal riding master, stood in the main aisle with his velvet cloak swept back, his face flushed with the kind of rage that only came from public incompetence. At the end of his leather lunge line stood Redoubt of Vaughan. The king's black stallion was a towering siege engine of muscle and bone, bred for the vanguard and entirely unsuited for the delicate dressage Julian favored. The riding master was currently attempting to force a heavy, double-jointed curb bit into the warhorse's mouth. From her peripheral vision, Maeve watched the angle of the metal and felt a dull ache behind her own teeth. It was a severe piece of iron, designed for brute leverage. Redoubt had been trained in the borderlands for neck reining and subtle weight shifts. Shoving a jointed curb into his jaw was a fundamental miscalculation of equine mechanics. "Hold him steady, you useless mud-born fools," Master Julian snapped, yanking the line as two stable boys scrambled to grip the stallion's halter. Redoubt did not panic. He simply calculated the geometry of the men holding him. The stallion planted his massive front hooves, lowered his heavy head, and snapped his neck upward in a short, brutal arc. The leverage ripped the lead line directly through Julian's gloved hands. Before the riding master could adjust his footing, the stallion swung his hind quarters with surgical precision, bumping Julian's chest just hard enough to break his balance. The newly appointed master tumbled backward, landing squarely in a deep wooden trough filled with fermented sour mash. A terrible, suffocating quiet descended over the stable corridor. Redoubt of Vaughan stood over the trough, lowered his velvet muzzle, and let out a rhythmic, bubbling rattle from his nostrils. To the terrified stable hands, it sounded like the wild snorting of a vicious beast. To Maeve, who spent her life decoding the silent language of muscle, tension, and breath, it was unmistakable. The horse was laughing at him. It was a sound of pure, cynical contempt. Julian dragged himself out of the trough, his fine velvet cloak dripping with pungent oats and fermented barley. His face was a mask of aristocratic fury. "If this animal is not broken by nightfall, I will have every groom in this corridor whipped for insubordination," he hissed, wiping sour mash from his cheekbone. "Secure the beast." No one moved. Maeve lowered her chin, pressed her cold fingers against her broom handle, and swept faster. She made herself small, matching the rhythm of the wind, rattling the wooden shutters. Julian stormed out of the corridor, leaving a trail of wet grain across the pristine stones. The remaining stable boys scattered instantly, finding urgent chores in the farthest corners of the keep. They left the black stallion standing loose in the main aisle, his dark coat slick with sweat, his ears pinned flat against his massive skull. Maeve set her broom against the damp stone wall. She did not run for the guard. She did not grab a whip. She did not fetch another heavy lead line. She simply turned her body sideways to minimize her silhouette and took one slow, deliberate step toward the agitated animal. Redoubt shifted his weight, his nostrils flaring wide enough to show the angry red lining within. He was running high on post-struggle adrenaline, his chest heaving, prepared to bolt or strike if another piece of iron was brought near his face. Maeve stopped just outside his striking distance. She did not speak. Magical whispers belonged in children's tales. Real equine communication was a matter of biological synchronization. She dropped her center of gravity, letting her shoulders slump to remove any predatory tension from her posture. She fixed her gaze on the horse's chest, deliberately avoiding direct eye contact, and slowed her own breathing. Inhale for 3 counts of the heavy stable air. Exhale for 4. She waited. The cold seeped through the thin soles of her leather boots, but she remained perfectly still. Her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. Redoute watched her. The stallion snorted a sharp testing sound, but Maeve did not flinch. She kept her hands open and relaxed at her sides. Slowly, the frantic heaving of the horse's ribs began to decelerate, matching the unhurried cadence of her lungs. The aggressive white ring around his dark eye softened. Up in the shadows of the stone gallery, standing perfectly still against the carved balustrade, King Gabriel Vaughan watched the silent exchange. He had come down to the mews to assess the damage his new riding master caused, only to find a groom standing down a warhorse that had put 3 armoured knights in the infirmary. The king did not announce himself. He merely observed, noting the precise, tactical patience the young woman displayed. He recognized competence when he saw it. Down in the aisle, the heavy tension finally broke. Redoute Vaughan let out a long exhale that blew the sawdust near Maeve's boots. His right ear twitched, swiveling backward, and then drifted slowly forward to lock onto her. Only then did Maeve move. She reached into her canvas apron, her movements fluid, and withdrew a single dried apple slice. She held it flat on her scarred palm. The stallion took a hesitant step forward, stretched his thick neck, and gently took the fruit from her skin with velvet lips. Maeve closed her fingers around the simple rope halter hanging loose from his jaw. She did not pull. She merely turned and began to walk, and the king's most dangerous mount followed her quietly into the shadows of his stall. The following day, the courtyard of the royal stronghold was a geometry of grey stone and bitter northern frost. Banners snapped in the wind, a sharp, cracking sound that usually made the lesser mounts dance nervously in their traces, their iron-shod hooves striking sparks against the granite. Redoute Vaughan did not dance. The towering black stallion stood anchored to the cobblestones, his breathing a slow, deliberate rhythm that Maeve Vance matched from her position at his shoulder. She held the simple rope halter, no harsh iron curb bit, no restricting chains, and kept her gaze lowered, making herself a shadow against his massive, muscle-corded flank. Archon Cynthia Sterling stood at the centre of the yard, delivering a speech of eternal loyalty to the sovereign court. Her voice carried the polished, empty cadence of high-born diplomacy, bouncing off the high stone walls. She wore flowing silk peace robes in deep amethyst, the expensive fabric billowing elegantly in the winter wind. The visiting dignitary spoke of unity, of secure winter treaties, and of the unbreakable blood bond between their territories. To the assembled lords, it was a flawless performance. To Maeve, watching the stallion's ears, it was a string of physical contradictions. Redoute's left ear swiveled back, then flattened against his skull. He lowered his massive head, his nostrils expanding to take in the scent of the Archon as she paced closer to the royal steps. The horse did not toss his head or paw the ground. He merely watched the woman with a cold, cynical intelligence. As Cynthia paused to emphasize a vow of peace, stepping within arm's reach of the beast, the stallion exhaled. It was not a snort of fear. It was a massive, wet, bubbling sneeze, delivered directly onto the Archon's pristine velvet boots. A collective, sharp breath echoed from the nobles. Cynthia froze, her smile turning brittle, the muscles of her jaw locking as she stared down at the damp ruin of her footwear. The court murmured about the unmanageable madness of the king's warhorse, assuming the beast was simply savage. Maeve knew better. She tightened her grip slightly on the rope, feeling the vibration in the stallion's neck. Redoute immediately shifted his weight backward, cocking his right hind leg, a defensive posture, preparing to strike or evade a solid mass. The stable hand did not look at the Archon's face. She looked at the way the silk robes draped over the dignitary's shoulders. The fabric moved stiffly. When Cynthia had stepped back from the sneeze, her footfall had been far too heavy for a woman, wearing only diplomatic finery. There was a faint, almost imperceptible friction sound, the muted grind of steel mesh rubbing against itself. The horse had not sneezed out of disrespect. He had smelled the oil used to maintain weaponry, and his ears had caught the unnatural metallic rustle hidden beneath the layers of silk. The Archon was wearing at least 3 layers of heavy under-armor. A dignitary preaching eternal peace was physically braced for an immediate assassination or a sudden skirmish. For a servant, keeping one's mouth shut was an essential survival tactic, one that cost nothing yet warded off a multitude of dangers. Maeve kept her posture perfectly slack, digesting the political threat through the biological reaction of an animal. She offered no apology to the emissary, merely stroking the stallion's thick neck to acknowledge his warning. She let the lords believe the horse was a brute. It was safer for a groom to be responsible for a clumsy animal than for a servant to possess treasonous intelligence. The frost had deepened into a biting chill by the time the courtyard finally emptied. Maeve returned to the quiet sanctuary of the lower mews, pulling the heavy oak door shut to block out the howling wind. The stable block offered immediate sensory comfort. It smelled heavily of dry straw, aged leather, and the faint, coppery tang of horse sweat. She stood beside a battered wooden workbench, her cracked knuckles working a piece of rough linen over a thick leather headstall. She rubbed yellow saddle soap into the grain, applying steady, rhythmic pressure to soften the stiff material. She did not hear him approach. King Gabriel Vaughan occupied silence, the way other men occupied speech, without apology, without the nervous impulse to fill it. The groom only realized she was no longer alone when the ambient temperature of the corridor seemed to shift, the draught from the archway blocked by a broad silhouette. She did not startle. She simply stopped the motion of her rag, her eyes remaining fixed on the brass buckle of the headstall. Master Julian claimed he needed a double-jointed bit to control him, Gabriel said. His voice was a low, unhurried drawl, carrying the natural authority of the sovereign without the need for volume. You hold him with a piece of braided hemp. A harsh bit only gives a frightened man the illusion of control, Your Majesty, Maeve answered. She kept her tone flat, administrative. She did not bow or curtsy. Her hands resumed their methodical circles over the leather. Redoute does not respect illusions. The king stepped closer, his heavy fur-lined cloak brushing against a wooden post. He did not crowd her space, stopping at a precise, deliberate distance that allowed her an unobstructed path to the door. He humiliated a visiting Archon today. The council demands he be kept in the iron stalls. He did not humiliate her, the stable hand said, her thumb tracing the edge of the leather strap. She weighed the risk of speaking against the safety of silence, choosing the practical truth of her trade. He assessed her. Archon Cynthia walks with the gait of a person carrying 30 extra pounds of weight across the chest and shoulders. The stallion hears the friction. He smells the weapon oil. Animals do not understand court titles, Your Majesty. They understand physics. They understand threats. Gabriel stood perfectly still. The quiet in the stable stretched, thick and measuring. He was not looking at the horse in the adjacent stall. He was looking at the low-status groom, who had just diagnosed a political conspiracy through the geometry of a beast's stride. "And what does he understand about you?" the sovereign asked, quietly. Maeve flipped the headstall over, working the soap into the reverse side. She focused entirely on the tactile friction of the cloth against the hide, masking the sudden tightness in her chest. "That I do not lie to him." The noble trainers approach him with their shoulders braced and their breath held tight, preparing for a fight. They tell him they are dominant, but their bodies tell him they are terrified. I approach him with a low center of gravity and an open hand. I offer him the truth of my own insignificance. Insignificance, Gabriel repeated, tasting the word. It was not a question. I am a stable hand, the young woman said, setting the polished leather down on the workbench. My only value is keeping your mounts fit for war. The king did not offer a contradictory compliment. He did not tell her she was wrong, nor did he attempt to cross the physical boundary she had so carefully maintained. He respected the line she had drawn in the cold stone of the Muse. Make sure the headstall is ready by tomorrow, Gabriel said, turning toward the archway. He paused, his profile a sharp shadow against the pale winter light. And Maeve. Do not underestimate the value of a person who can read the truth in a room full of liars. He walked away, his heavy boots making no sound on the straw-strewn floor. Maeve stared at the brass buckle, her fingers pressing into the cold metal until the skin turned white. She had spent her life learning to be invisible, but as the scent of pine and ozone faded from the corridor, she knew with absolute certainty that she had just been seen. 3 days later, the inner courtyard of the fortress was a geometry of grey frost and wrought iron. The High Council had gathered for the formal presentation of the royal mounts, a midwinter tradition meant to project stability before the solstice. Maeve Vance stood near the arched stone pillars, holding a coiled lead rope with bare, calloused hands. She kept her posture straight, and her gaze angled toward the paving stones, letting the heavy wool of her cloak blend into the shadows. Beside her stood Redoubt of Vaughan, a monolithic mass of black muscle and scarred hide, exhaling thick plumes of white vapor into the freezing northern air. The assembled court watched the warhorse with thinly veiled distaste, seeing only a violent brute that had already humiliated half the noble riding masters. Maeve saw something entirely different. She saw a hyper-vigilant creature, mapping the courtyard's atmospheric pressure, processing every hidden spike in a lord's heart rate and every metallic clink of a sword belt. Chancellor Thomas Eld stood in the front row, his expression a mask of polite boredom. He wore heavy robes of deep maroon velvet trimmed in fox fur, speaking in a measured tone about wintergrain tariffs, the picture of unshakable administrative control. Then Redoubt turned his massive head. He locked his dark, unblinking eyes on the Chancellor. Slowly, the horse extended his thick neck forward, raised his muzzle toward the slate-grey sky, and curled his upper lip back, exposing his teeth and pale gums in a sharp, sustained grimace. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the gathered nobles. Someone whispered that the beast was openly mocking the master of coin. They thought it was a crude animal trick, a reflection of the horse's untamable insolence. Maeve did not laugh. It was a phlegmon response. The stallion was pressing a specific scent against his vomeronasal organ, analyzing a chemical signature too faint for human noses. Redoubt snorted a heavy blast of air against the frost-covered stones, and immediately raised his muzzle to curl his lip again, his attention unyieldingly anchored to Thomas. Maeve shifted her quiet gaze to the man. From a distance, the Chancellor looked entirely unbothered, offering a tolerant, tight-lipped smile. But Maeve's survival had been built on watching what powerful men tried to hide. Behind the heavy fold of maroon robes, his left hand was twitching. His knuckles turned dead white as his fingers dug frantically into the fabric of his own sleeve. The man was vibrating with suppressed panic. Redoubt stepped forward, his iron shoes ringing sharply against the cobblestones. He flared his nostrils, his ears pinning back a fraction of an inch, a calculated shift of aggression, masking deep suspicion. Thomas took a microscopic step backward. His smile remained frozen, but his breathing had gone visibly shallow. The horse was smelling fear. It was a profound, cold, sweet terror leaking through layers of expensive wool, the kind of chemical panic that only came from a man standing on the absolute edge of a blade. The presentation concluded shortly before the solstice sun broke through the clouds. Maeve led the black stallion back to the lower mews, the rhythmic strike of hooves echoing heavily against the stone corridors. The air here smelled familiar and safe: dried alfalfa, crushed oats, and the sharp tang of leather soap. She had just secured the heavy iron latch of the stall when a tall shadow blocked the entrance to the walkway. King Gabriel Vaughan occupied silence, the way other men occupied speech. He simply stood at the edge of the lantern light, wrapped in a dark woolen cloak, his presence commanding an immediate, breathless stillness. Maeve lowered her head, stepping back to offer the sovereign his rightful space. She did not speak. Silence was a kind of armor, thinner than most, but lighter to carry. Gabriel stepped forward, looking at the quiet woman who had managed to hold a beast of war, steady, with nothing but a frayed rope. "The council believes my warhorse has developed a sense of humor," Gabriel murmured, his voice low and resonant. "They claim the beast was smiling at the exchequer to mock his station." Maeve kept her gaze respectfully fixed on the frayed edge of his cloak. "Horses do not mock, your grace. They do not possess the capacity for human arrogance." Gabriel stopped a few feet away, slowly turning a scarred copper ring around his index finger. "Then what was he doing, Maeve?" It was a direct question. She lifted her chin, meeting the king's quiet, assessing gaze with undeniable clarity. "It is called a flamen response," she explained, her tone practical and measured. Redoute was analyzing him. The Chancellor was projecting a massive spike in stress hormones. The horse could smell the chemical breakdown of cold sweat through the thick wool of his robes. Gabriel absorbed the information without a physical flinch. He did not dismiss her observation as uneducated foolishness. "A man managing the winter grain tariffs has no reason to sweat in the freezing cold," Gabriel murmured. The copper ring turned again, a slow scrape of metal against skin. "Unless the ledgers he balances are built on treason, or he is terrified of someone else standing in that courtyard." Maeve did not confirm or deny the political implication. "The horse reads what the body cannot lie about," she said quietly. Gabriel looked away, his gaze shifting to the dark wood of the stall. The financial administrator of the sovereign court was concealing absolute terror, and the crown only knew because a beast of war had found the scent offensive. "Keep him close," Gabriel ordered softly, his voice carrying the distinct weight of an approaching storm. "And keep your eyes on the men who refuse to look at him." He turned and walked back into the deeper shadows, leaving Maeve alone in the quiet warmth of the stables. The scent of crushed oats suddenly felt terribly fragile against the creeping, inevitable cold of the stones. The following morning, the frost in the main courtyard of the stone citadel held a bitter edge, glazing the cobblestones in a thin layer of treacherous ice. Maeve Vance stood near the perimeter, her posture naturally blending into the shadows of the heavy oak doors. It was a habit forged by years of necessary invisibility within the sovereign hierarchy. Across the yard, the noble trainers were gathered in a tense semicircle. Their velvet-lined cloaks stood in sharp contrast to the practical, worn leather of the stable hands. At the center stood King Gabriel Vaughan. His presence dominated the space not through volume, but through the terrifying stillness of a man who required no performance to assert his sovereignty. Beside the king, the black stallion, Redoute of Vaughan, stood with his ears swiveled backward, capturing the nervous, erratic breathing of the assembled men. The horse shifted his weight, his heavy iron-shod hooves striking the stone with a rhythmic, impatient cadence. Gabriel rested a single gloved hand on the stallion's shoulder, feeling the vibrating tension beneath the thick coat. His gaze drifted across the line of trainers, locking on to Julian Thorne. "The solstice procession requires absolute precision," Gabriel said, his voice a low drawl that cut cleanly through the freezing air. "It does not require brute force. It does not require a curb bit that tears the mouth of my mount." Master Julian stiffened, his jaw locking tight. "Your Majesty, the beast is—" "The beast!" Gabriel interrupted, his tone devoid of anger but heavy with finality. "Requires a handler who understands him. You have proven you do not." The sovereign turned slightly, his pale eyes finding Maeve in the periphery. He did not issue a loud proclamation. He simply extended his hand toward her. Maeve Vance. She stepped forward, keeping her gaze appropriately lowered, her breath curling in white plumes in the frigid air. "You will take primary responsibility for Redoubt," Gabriel stated, the decree falling like a stone into a still pond. "No other trainer is to touch his tack, dictate his feed, or guide him into the procession. He is yours to manage." A suffocating quiet descended over the courtyard. To bypass the royal riding master for a low-status groom was an administrative earthquake. The nobles exchanged sharp glances, but none dared voice an objection under the king's calculating stare. "Master Julian," Gabriel continued, his attention shifting back to the rigid nobleman. "The stable keys. Hand them over." Julian's face flushed a deep, mottled red, the color of bruised plums against the pale winter morning. For a fraction of a second, Maeve saw the man's pride war with his survival instinct. Slowly, agonizingly, the nobleman reached into his heavy woolen coat and withdrew the heavy ring of brass stable keys. He stepped toward Maeve, his boots crunching loudly against the frost. When he extended his arm, his hands were trembling with the violent vibration of suppressed, humiliated fury. The metal keys clinked together, a sharp sound that made Redoubt flick an ear in mild irritation. Maeve accepted the heavy ring. She did not smile, nor did she meet Julian's eyes. She offered a silent, perfectly measured bow, sliding the keys into the deep pocket of her apron. She felt no triumph, only the immediate, crushing weight of vulnerability. By elevating her, the king had unknowingly painted a target squarely on her back. She was no longer just a groom. She was a physical manifestation of the riding master's public inadequacy. As the court dispersed, Maeve let the knowledge settle into her like cold water into stone, slow, thorough, and filling every crack. She had survived by being unseen. Now, she was dangerously visible. The interior of the sovereign muse was a cavern of sensory contrasts after nightfall. The freezing wind battered the high stone walls outside, but inside the air was thick with the latent heat of 24 massive warhorses, the scent of dried alfalfa, and the sharp tang of leather oil. Maeve walked the central corridor, a single tallow lantern in her hand, casting long, distorted shadows against the wooden stalls. She moved with practiced silence, her soft-soled boots making no sound on the packed earth, pausing only to check a latch or adjust a heavy blanket over a resting mare. She had just finished securing the latch on the feed room when a shadow detached itself from the gloom near the tack harnesses. Julian Thorne stepped into the dim circle of her lantern light. He had shed his heavy velvet cloak, standing in his tailored riding leathers. In the claustrophobic space of the nighttime stables, stripped of the king's presence, the man's arrogance had calcified into something far more dangerous. "You think you have won a great victory, girl," Master Julian whispered, his voice a harsh rasp that caused a nearby gelding to snort in alarm. He took a deliberate step forward, crowding her space. "You think the sovereign's favor is a shield. Kings grow bored. Beasts remain beasts. And when that black monster inevitably turns on you, there will be no one to sweep up the pieces." Maeve did not step back. To retreat was to signal prey behavior, a lesson she had learned long ago from the animals she tended. Instead, she held the lantern steady, letting the yellow light illuminate the tight, furious lines of his face. She offered no defense, no pleading explanation. Not the kind of silence that falls between words, the kind that swallows them whole. She let his threat hang in the damp air, refusing to give him the satisfaction of a panicked reaction. Master Julian's eyes narrowed, his hands balling into fists at his sides. He took another aggressive step, closing the distance until Maeve could smell the stale wine on his breath and the metallic tang of his anger. "I will see you ruined for this humiliation," he hissed, raising a hand, as if to snatch the brass keys from her apron. "You are nothing but dirt beneath a horse's hoof, and you will learn." A massive weight slammed against the wooden partition of the adjacent stall. The thick oak boards groaned under the impact, the sound echoing like a cannon shot through the quiet mews. Redoubt of Vaughan did not whinny, he did not rear, operating entirely on the territorial instincts of a dominant herd protector. The giant black stallion shifted his 2,000-pound frame, driving his heavy hindquarters firmly against the stall door until the iron hinges screamed. With a singular fluid motion, Redoute swung his massive head over the partition, the whites of his eyes flashing in the lantern light. He lowered his muzzle directly between Master Julian and Maeve, flattening his ears completely against his skull, a universal equine signal for imminent lethal violence. Julian froze, his raised hand hung suspended in the air. The stallion exhaled a long, hot breath that ruffled the hair on the nobleman's forehead, the sound a low, rattling vibration deep within the horse's massive chest. Redoubt shifted his weight to his right hind leg, planting it firmly on the stone, his muscles bunched and ready to strike if the human predator advanced another inch. The riding master swallowed hard, the Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. The raw, unfiltered aggression of a sovereign war horse was a force no amount of court status could negotiate with. The beast was not defending a master. He was protecting a recognized member of his herd. Slowly, carefully, Julian lowered his hand. He took one step back, then another, his boot scraping clumsily against the dirt floor. He did not speak another word. The nobleman turned and walked briskly toward the stable exit, the heavy wooden door shutting with a hollow thud behind him. Maeve remained perfectly still until the sound of his footsteps faded into the howling wind outside. She lowered the lantern and turned to look at Redoubt. The stallion's ears flicked forward, the tension draining from his massive frame in an instant. He let out a soft, blowing snort and nudged her shoulder with his velvet nose, demanding his evening ration of sweet grass. Maeve reached up, pressing her cold fingers against his warm jaw, understanding with absolute clarity that the most dangerous politics in the keep were no longer happening in the throne room, but right here in the dark. 3 days before the solstice ride, the tack room adjoining the sovereign mews was a narrow, windowless vault that smelled permanently of melted beeswax, rendered fat and old dust. The only light came from a single tallow candle, guttering in an iron sconce, casting long, wavering shadows across the walls. Maeve Vance sat on a low wooden stool, her cracked knuckles working a piece of rough canvas over a heavy bridle. It was solitary, repetitive labor, the kind of quiet endurance she had built her entire survival upon. The space was usually a sanctuary, but tonight the air felt thick, heavy, with an undercurrent of chemical sweetness that did not belong among the familiar scents of pine and dry straw. Resting on a sturdy wooden trestle, just inches from the slatted partition of the main stall, was the newly delivered equipment for the upcoming solstice procession. The hemlock-oiled ceremonial saddle was a masterpiece of royal craftsmanship, constructed from thick, dark leather and lined with dense white sheepskin. The royal saddlers had brought it down just past dusk, leaving it under strict orders that it were to be kept pristine for King Gabriel. Maeve dipped her rag into a tin of saddle soap, but the rhythm of her work faltered. Through the wooden slats of the partition, she heard the distinct, heavy shifting of a massive body. Redoute of Vaughan was pacing. It was not the rhythmic, impatient walk of a war horse eager for exercise, nor the aggressive stomping of a stallion challenging a rival. It was a jerky, evasive shuffle. She set her rag down and moved closer to the partition, peering through the narrow gaps into the dim stall. The towering black stallion was pressing his entire weight against the farthest stone wall, as if trying to push himself through the solid masonry. His ears were pinned flat against his skull, and his neck was craned away from the wooden slats dividing his space from the tack room. Maeve frowned, watching the mechanics of his distress. Redoubt flared his nostrils wide, exposing the pale pink tissue inside, pulling the air in with sharp, jerky gasps. His breathing pattern had turned shallow and asymmetric, a physical manifestation of deep, instinctual panic. Whenever the drafts in the corridor shifted, blowing the air from the tack room into the stall, the horse hollowed his massive back, dropping his spine in a desperate attempt to avoid some unseen pressure. He was not looking at her. The animal's wide, white-rimmed eyes were fixed entirely on the wooden slats directly behind the trestle. He was staring at the wall where the heavy ceremonial gear rested. Maeve moved a step to her left, placing her body between the saddle and the partition. The stallion immediately lowered his head a fraction, his breathing slowing by a single beat. She looked back at the resting leather. The faint, cloying sweetness in the air seemed to originate entirely from the thick sheepskin lining. It was a scent that spoke of crushed leaves and bitter sap, masquerading beneath the heavy polish. The horse was not merely throwing a tantrum. He was violently rejecting the equipment meant to carry the sovereign, utilizing every inch of his physical posture to communicate a profound, immediate danger. Maeve turned away from the partition and approached the trestle, her movements slow and deliberate. She reached out, her fingertips hovering just above the dark leather of the saddle flap, intending to trace the heavy stitching along the pommel. The royal equipment is not meant for the hands of a common groom. The voice was smooth, cultured, and entirely unexpected. Maeve pulled her hand back, keeping her spine perfectly straight, as she turned toward the open archway of the tack room. Steward Alistair Finch stood in the threshold, his dark velvet cloak blending seamlessly into the shadows of the corridor. The personal steward to the high archon moved with a quiet grace that always felt slightly too calculated for the damp, working environment of the stables. He stepped into the dim light of the tallow candle, his expression a mask of polite curiosity. There was no warmth in the room, yet he did not shiver. Maeve kept her posture neutral, dropping her hands to her sides and wiping her palms against her coarse apron. She did not speak. She had spent enough of her life learning that silence offered a unique protection. A barrier thinner than steel, but much easier to wear. I was told the new handler took her duties seriously, Alistair continued, his boots making almost no sound against the stone floor as he closed the distance between them. But I hardly expected to find you lurking in the dark with the king's personal gear. I was appointed to manage his mount, my lord, the groom answered, her voice low and even, devoid of any defensive edge. Part of that management includes ensuring the tack is ready for the morning ride. Alistair stopped beside the trestle, his gaze drifting from her face to the heavy leather resting between them. He reached out with a pale, immaculate hand and idly adjusted a silver buckle on the exquisite royal tack. The metal clinked softly against the leather. As he touched the gear, a fresh wave of that bitter, sweet scent rolled off the sheepskin, and from the adjacent stall, Redoubt let out a sharp, rattling snort of agitation. The steward did not flinch at the sound of the massive beast. Instead, his eyes remained fixed on Maeve's hands, dropping the facade of polite inquiry for a brief, chilling moment. His look was cold, measuring, and entirely devoid of the aristocratic indifference he usually projected. He was calculating exactly how much she knew, weighing her low status against her unprecedented access to the sovereign's mount. "It is a beautiful piece of craftsmanship," the man murmured, his fingers lingering on the thick, treated sheepskin beneath the cantle. "It would be a tragedy if anything were to happen to it, or to the one responsible for its care. The crown relies on perfection for the solstice. The horse is particular about his gear, Maeve said simply, refusing to take the bait, refusing to show the sudden, icy certainty settling in her chest. "I only watch to see what he accepts." "See that he accepts it," Alistair replied softly, giving the silver buckle one final, precise tug. A beast that refuses to bear its master is no longer useful. He turned and walked back out into the freezing corridor, his velvet cloak sweeping silently over the damp stone. The heavy oak door of the royal tack room clicked shut behind him. Maeve did not move until the faint sound of his footsteps completely faded into the howling wind outside the mews. She stood in the dim, flickering light, listening to the terrified, asymmetric breathing of the stallion on the other side of the wall. As silence reclaimed the stone walls, broken only by the faint, rhythmic drafting of the northern wind through the high clerestory windows, Maeve let her breathing slow. She allowed the metallic adrenaline of the encounter with Alistair to bleed out into the cold air. When she was certain she was completely alone, she turned her attention back to the wooden saddle rack. Resting upon it was the designated solstice saddle, an imposing piece of craftsmanship reserved exclusively for the solstice procession. The outer flaps were carved with the intricate crest of the sovereign court, the thick bridle leather gleaming under the dim ambient light. It was a massive construct of oak framing, reinforced iron cantles, and layers of compressed cowhide designed to elevate the sovereign above the crowds. To a noble lord or a casual groom, it was a masterpiece of equine equipment. To Maeve, who understood the exact chemistry required to maintain such material in the bitter northern damp, it was a sudden, glaring anomaly. She knew the weight of every piece of tack in the mews by heart, knew the specific friction of every strap and buckle. She stepped closer. The scent was the first warning. It was not the familiar, clean aroma of beeswax and saddle soap, nor the rich, earthy undertone of neat's foot oil used to keep the leather supple. There was a sharp, medicinal edge cutting through the heavy grease. Maeve reached out and carefully turned the heavy saddle over to expose the thick sheepskin lining designed to rest against the horse's back and shield the rider's inner thigh. The wool fibers were matted slightly in the center, darker than the surrounding pristine white. Not because it was dirty, but because it was saturated. She pressed her thumb against the dense wool. The material did not yield with the usual dry friction of natural fleece. It clung. Slowly, Maeve scraped her index fingernail against the deepest layer of the fibers, peeling back a thin layer of substance hidden just beneath the surface. She held her hand to the meager light of the lantern. A thick, waxy residue coated her fingernail. It possessed a greenish-black tint, clinging to her skin with an almost unnatural viscosity. She brought her hand closer to her face, allowing the volatile compounds to register in her nasal passages. The underlying odor hit her with precise, undeniable clarity. It was the bitter, green scent of crushed hemlock, mixed with the sweet, cloying poison of ground oleander root. This was not a poorly mixed leather conditioner. It was a highly concentrated, slow-acting neurological toxin, suspended in a dense wax that would remain dormant in the cold air of the mews. The mechanics of the murder were chillingly elegant. Once placed upon a massive, heat-generating animal like Redoute of Vaughan, the thermal energy of the stallion's body would melt the wax. The liquefied toxin would seep upward through the leather flaps, transferring directly into the exposed skin of King Gabriel Vaughan's legs during the long, unhurried solstice ride. The leather would act as a slow, fatal poultice. The king would dismount at the ceremonial grounds and collapse, his heart stopping without a single visible wound, leaving the court to assume a natural failure of the body. Maeve wiped her fingernail meticulously against a scrap of rough linen, ensuring none of the deadly paste remained on her skin. The physical reality of the treason settled in her chest like a heavy iron weight, solid and inescapable. She needed documentation. The physical presence of the poison was undeniable. but presenting a tainted saddle to the sovereign guard without proving its origin would only lead to her own swift execution. For tampering with royal equipment, a groom accusing a high-ranking courtier of treason required more than a matted patch of wool. Maeve left the tack room, keeping her footsteps light and measured against the cobblestones as she moved toward the stablemaster's private office. The room was cramped, smelling of stale pipe tobacco and dried ink. The stablemaster was a man of rigid administrative habits, a trait Maeve relied upon heavily to navigate the complex hierarchy of the Muse. She did not light the desk lantern. Instead, she used the pale moonlight filtering through the frosted glass to locate what she needed. Her hands moved across the cluttered desk with practiced efficiency until her fingers brushed the thick, embossed cover of the oiling ledger. It was the master registry of every chemical, soap, and solvent requisitioned for the maintenance of the royal stables. Maeve opened the heavy cover. The parchment pages rustled softly in the dark, the sound dry and loud in the enclosed space. She bypassed the standard seasonal entries for pine tar, hoof oil, and winter dubbing, running her finger down the columns of the current month. The entries were written in the stablemaster's familiar, blocky script, detailing routine purchases of flaxseed and leather dyes. However, near the bottom of the registry for the previous week, a different requisition caught her eye. It was an order for an alkaline solvent, a highly specific chemical agent normally reserved for breaking down harsh dyes. It was also the exact catalyst required to bond raw oleander paste to a waxy base without destroying the leather it was applied to. Someone had used the stable's own budget to mask the acquisition of a lethal binding agent. She turned the page to check the authorizing signature. Her hand stopped in the air. The next page was gone. Maeve leaned closer, her eyes adjusting to the thin light. She traced her bare finger along the coarse binding twine at the center of the spine. The removal was not a clean cut from a knife. The parchment had been yanked out by force, leaving tiny, jagged fragments of paper clinging to the thick thread. Not an administrative correction, but an act of panicked concealment. She pressed her fingertip against the torn edge of the binding. The surface felt strangely slick. Lifting her hand, she rubbed her thumb and forefinger together, feeling a familiar, viscous resistance. She brought her fingers to her nose. There, unmistakable against the dusty scent of old parchment, was the faint, bitter trace of hemlock. The person who had torn the record from the oiling ledger had done so with the toxin still lingering on their hands. The greasy smudge was a physical signature, a bridge connecting the poisonous wax in the saddle to the missing administrative record. It was an oversight born of arrogance. The conspirators had assumed that no one in the lower castes possessed the intelligence to check a stable registry, just as they assumed a warhorse was nothing more than a dumb beast capable only of carrying a man to his death. Maeve closed the heavy ledger. The silence of the office felt different now. It was no longer the empty quiet of a sleeping stable, but the pressurized stillness of a trap waiting to be sprung. She had the administrative proof of the cover-up. Now, she just needed to observe who the Stallion recognized as the true architect of the crime. She slipped out of the office and made her way back to the Sovereign Muse. Back in the dim light of Redout's stall, the chill of the winter night seeped through the thin wool of Maeve Vance's tunic, but the true source of the drop in temperature lodged deep within her chest. The damning truth of the laced leather weighed heavier than any physical burden. She had found the poison. She knew exactly how the heat-activated toxin would slip through the royal garments once the king mounted. Yet, knowing the mechanics of murder was not enough to stop it. If a low-status, stable hand approached the royal guard with an accusation of high treason, the outcome was mathematically predictable. The captain of the guard would demand a culprit. If she had no name to offer, the true architect of the plot, would simply redirect the blame onto the girl who conveniently discovered the tainted gear. The court hierarchy was a machine designed to protect its highest echelons by grinding down its lowest laborers. A groom crying wolf without an ironclad target would be marched to the gallows for treasonous slander before the sun reached its zenith. That was the kind of invisible she had become, a disposable buffer for elite betrayals. She stepped deeper into the straw, seeking the massive, dark shape shifting quietly in the shadows. Redoubt of Vaughan lowered his massive head, exhaling a long, slow breath that ruffled her hair. Maeve leaned forward and pressed her forehead against the solid, radiating warmth of his black shoulder. Her hands gripped the coarse fabric of her apron to stop their subtle trembling. The stable was silent, save for the methodical, rhythmic grinding of the stallion chewing a mouthful of dry hay. The sound was steady, grounded, utterly unbothered by the precarious geometries of the sovereign court above them. She matched her breathing to his deep inhalations, letting the raw, earthy scent of dust and sweetgrass settle her racing pulse. She could not just expose the weapon. She had to expose the hand that wielded it, and to do that, she needed to let the true poisoner walk right up to the trap, unaware that they were being watched by an observer who did not speak human words. The heavy wooden door at the far end of the corridor rattled faintly in the wind, a reminder of how exposed she was. The hemlock-oiled ceremonial saddle sat untouched in the secure tack room down the hall, a silent executioner waiting for the solstice morning. Maeve closed her eyes, feeling the powerful muscle twitch beneath the horse's sleek coat. She had spent enough of her life learning not to cry in front of people who would not understand why. Now she had to learn how to lay a snare without making a single sound. Redoubt shifted his weight, his ears swiveling toward the main gate. The dawn was coming, bringing with it the daily procession of noble visitors inspecting the sovereign mounts. Morning arrived with a biting frost. The heavy iron gates of the sovereign's mews swung open, admitting the sharp grey light and the daily parade of aristocrats. Maeve busied herself with a pitchfork, her posture deliberately slouched, her eyes fixed on the damp flagstones. By maintaining the appearance of a mindless labourer, she became part of the architecture, entirely ignored by the high-ranking figures strolling through the aisles. She watched carefully as Chancellor Thomas Eld passed by the Black Stallion's enclosure. The official merely paused to straighten his collar, and the horse flicked his left ear, noting the man's usual sweat-drenched scent but displaying no physical alarm. A few moments later, Archon Cynthia Sterling stopped to admire the royal mounts, her heavy silk robes rustling over the stone. The beast snorted and turned his back, communicating mild disdain, but his muscles remained loose. Then the atmospheric pressure in the corridor seemed to drop. Steward Alistair Finch approached, his boots making precise, unhurried strikes against the floor. He wore a placid, polite expression, moving like a man entirely confident in his invisible machinations. Maeve kept her head bowed over the straw, tracking the animal's reaction from the corner of her vision. The moment the man crossed into the stallion's scent boundary, the beast's reaction was instantaneous and violent. The stallion threw his head high, the whites of his eyes flashing in the dim light, his ears pinned flat against his skull, transforming his profile into something sharp and reptilian. The thick muscles along his neck bunched, and he aggressively bared his flat yellow teeth, pulling his lips back in a silent, jagged snarl. The visiting official halted, his polite smile freezing into place. He carried the lingering, chemical residue of the crushed oleander and hemlock on his skin, a scent too faint for human noses, but screamingly obvious to a hyper-observant prey animal whose respiratory tract was already sensitized to it, attempting to project authority in front of the surrounding royal guards. Alistair reached into his tailored coat and produced a long, washed carrot. He extended his gloved hand toward the iron bars, speaking in a low, smooth tone designed to mask his inner tension. Maeve's grip on the pitchfork handle tightened, until her knuckles turned white against the polished wood. She knew exactly what the horse was calculating. The warhorse did not retreat. Instead, he lifted his massive right foreleg and drove his iron-shod hoof down against the stone flags with bone-shaking force. The impact echoed through the cavernous corridor like a gunshot, sending a sharp, brilliant spark flying from the flinty rock. The explosive violence of the gesture forced the steward to flinch violently, stumbling backward and dropping the root vegetable into the muck. The stallion let out a rhythmic, bubbling rattle from deep within his chest, a clear, untranslatable warning. Maeve continued raking the straw, her face perfectly blank. She had her target. The horse had identified the poisoner. Now, she just needed the physical evidence to bind the man to the crime before the solstice procession began. On the eve of the solstice, the midnight air in the vast castle held a heavy chill that settled deep into the marrow, tasting faintly of frost and rusted iron. Maeve moved through the lower corridors of the Sovereign Mews without a lantern, navigating purely by the slight shifts in temperature and the familiar drafts leaking beneath the heavy stable doors. The darkness was absolute, broken only by the faint, rhythmic exhalations of resting warhorses and the occasional shifting of hooves against dry straw. She knew the geometry of these halls perfectly. Every uneven flagstone, every protruding iron ring, every low-hanging timber was mapped securely in her muscle memory. She retraced the exact path Steward Alistair Finch had taken 2 nights prior. The man had appeared in the private tack room with practiced silence, moving like a shadow across the stone. But no one moved through the mews without leaving a disturbance in the dust or a shift in the ambient scent. Maeve kept her right hand trailing lightly along the rough-hewn wooden support pillars. She closed her eyes for a moment, visualizing the stride of a man walking hastily in near-total darkness, carrying something he could not afford to drop. A man attempting to remain unseen would stick close to the walls, avoiding the open center of the aisle. The corridor connecting the inner stalls to the outer courtyard narrowed sharply, near the 3rd structural beam. Someone unfamiliar with the stables would naturally cut that blind corner too close. Maeve paused at the heavy oak post. She ran her bare fingertips over the coarse grain of the wood, feeling for the slightest anomaly. About waist-high, the tactile sensation changed. It was not dried pine resin or damp rot. The substance smeared against the timber was thick, greasy, and unnaturally cold. Maeve pressed her thumb firmly into the residue, feeling its strange density, then brought her hand close to her face. The scent was faint, yet unmistakable in the stagnant air. A sharp, bitter chemical warning struck the back of her throat. It was the crushing smell of hemlock layered beneath the cloying, floral mask of oleander. Alistair Finch had brushed his sleeve against this exact pillar. The man had carried the toxic compound through the dark, transferring a fraction of the deadly wax onto the wood in his haste. Beneath her cracked fingers, that invisible smear transformed into concrete, undeniable physical proof. The visiting dignitary's steward was tied directly to the tampered tack. She stood absolutely still, processing the sheer scale of the treason. The High Archon's personal servant was actively setting a trap for the crown, moving freely within the king's own walls, armed with a slow-acting poison designed to mimic a natural failure of the heart. Maeve needed to preserve this mark. She scraped a sliver of the contaminated wax with her thumbnail, transferring it to a small fold of clean linen she kept tucked in her apron pocket. The fabric absorbed the grease, holding the lethal evidence secure. Before she could step away from the contaminated pillar, the heavy iron hinges of the main stable doors let out a low, drawn-out groan, Maeve froze, pressing her back against the shadows of the wooden support. The footsteps that followed were not the sharp, frantic pacing of a guard on patrol. They were slow, deliberate, and entirely unhurried. The heavy boots struck the stone with the cadence of absolute authority, lacking the performative rhythm of the daytime court. King Gabriel Vaughan stepped into the dim aisle. He carried no torch, no armed escort shadowed his movements. The monarch was entirely alone, wrapped in a thick, dark velvet cloak thrown over a plain wool tunic. In the meagre moonlight filtering through the high windows, the angular lines of his jaw looked hollowed out by sheer exhaustion. He did not announce his presence. He simply walked toward the far end of the corridor, his gaze fixed straight ahead, stopping only when he reached the massive, iron-barred stall housing Redoubt of Vaughan. Maeve stepped out from behind the structural beam, quietly wiping her hands against her coarse apron to remove any lingering trace of the wax. She made no sudden movements. Her leather-soled boots made zero sound against the hay-strewn floor, but the king registered her presence immediately. He did not turn around or reach for a weapon. He merely let his rigid shoulders drop a fraction of an inch. Gabriel looked around the utilitarian space, locating an overturned wooden bucket near the heavy grain bins. Without a word of preamble, the sovereign of the Silver Keep sat down. The heavy velvet of his expensive cloak pooled over the packed earth, catching the dry, broken ends of straw and fine dust. He did not seem to care about the ruin of the fabric. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, staring at the uneven ground. Redoubt lowered his massive, scarred head over the stall door. The towering black stallion exhaled a long, warm breath directly into the king's dark hair, ruffling the strands. Most men would have flinched away from the sudden proximity of teeth that had previously crushed bone. Gabriel simply closed his eyes and let the beast inspect him. "The entire keep smells of perfumed lies," Gabriel said. His voice was a low, resonant murmur that barely disturbed the quiet of the aisle. "I came down here tonight because the horses do not know how to flatter. They only know how to react." Maeve stood 6 feet away, maintaining a respectful distance. The folded linen cloth in her pocket felt heavier than a forged iron anchor. She looked at the powerful man, sitting on a cheap bucket. He was completely unguarded, stripped of the crown's heavy armor, seeking the unadorned, honest silence of a cold barn to escape the relentless pressure of his own court. The fierce urge to speak rose in her throat. She could pull the linen from her pocket right now. She could tell him about the laced leather, about the steward's late-night visits, about the calculated trap waiting for him at the solstice ride. But stating the truth in the dark, without a public demonstration, would force the king to act on the unverified word of a low-status groom against a visiting dignitary. The court would demand formal counsels and endless delays. The evidence would vanish, and she would likely be executed for treasonous slander before the sun rose. The truth had to be proven in the light, where no Archon could ever deny it. Instead of speaking, Maeve picked up a stiff-bristled grooming brush from a nearby stone ledge. She stepped up to the stall door beside the king and began to work the brush over the stallion's thick neck. The rhythmic, repetitive sound of the bristles scraping through the coarse hair filled the quiet aisle, creating a steady, grounding cadence. Gabriel did not ask her to stop. He sat on the bucket, watching the steady, mechanical motion of her hands. The deep, defensive tension locked across his shoulders slowly began to unravel. They remained there in the dark, separated by a few feet of dusty air, sharing the quiet sanctuary of the Muse while the lethal threat of the solstice loomed just outside the heavy doors. A few hours later, just before dawn, the lower wards of the sprawling palace smelled of lye, wood ash, and raw brine, a sharp, industrial contrast to the sweet hay of the royal Muse. Maeve navigated the slick, frost-coated cobblestones, keeping her head lowered as she slipped into the open processing sheds of the palace tannery. She did not approach the master tanner for a finished cut of luxury calfskin. Instead, she quietly bartered 3 copper coins with an exhausted apprentice for a large, untreated pigskin scrap from the discard pile. The irregular piece was pale, stiff with heavy curing salt, and entirely devoid of value to the royal household. To Maeve, it was the exact biological analogue she required. The dense, porous nature of the swine hide mirrored the absorption rate of human skin with terrifying accuracy, making it the only material capable of safely proving the chemical threat she suspected. Returning to her quarters above the mews required slipping past the sleeping grooms without disturbing the heavy, groaning floorboards. Her room was nothing more than a narrow closet tucked beneath the slate eaves, completely unheated and practically exposed to the brutal northern elements. The damp winter drafts seeped through the loose stone mortar, settling into her bones like freezing water. She sat on the edge of her thin straw cot, resting the pale, rigid hide across her knee. She withdrew her small utility knife from her leather belt. The blade was worn, sharpened so many times over the years that the profile had slightly curved, but the steel edge remained surgically precise. She pressed the metal against the hide and began to scrape. The preserving salt crystals flaked away with a dry, rhythmic rasp. Her fingers were already numb from the freezing ambient air, the knuckles turning a brittle white as she maintained a steady, calculated angle against the material. If too much salt remained on the surface, the abrasive crystals would block the oiled toxin, and the chemical test would be fatally flawed. The gritty, bitter-tasting residue fell onto her coarse woolen skirt like dirty snow. Muteness had always been her chosen refuge, a subtle camouflage that demanded no toll on her spirit. She wore it now as she worked in the freezing dark, letting the repetitive, grounding motion of the blade anchor her focus against the sheer scale of the treason she was uncovering. The royal guards would never believe the theoretical word of a stable hand over the established rank of the High Archon's steward without visual proof. The scraped surface of the hide gradually grew smooth and pliable beneath her calloused thumb. She blew a long plume of white breath over the clean leather, dusting away the final microscopic grains of salt. The canvas was finally ready. She carefully sliced the hide into 2 equal squares. The private tack room was heavily locked, but the thick oak door possessed a slight warp near the bottom iron hinges, a structural flaw Maeve had discovered during her first winter in the keep. She pressed her weight against the lower panel, sliding through the narrow gap and pulling the heavy wood shut behind her. The air inside the windowless chamber was thick with the heavy scent of beeswax, neat's foot oil, and the faint, bitter botanical undertone she now recognized instantly. In the center of the room, resting on a polished mahogany display stand, sat the heavily treated riding equipment. It was a masterpiece of sovereign craftsmanship, heavily tooled with the royal crest and lined with thick, dense sheepskin designed for long, grueling ceremonial rides. Maeve set her small oil lantern on a nearby wooden stool. She turned the brass dial on the side of the lamp, raising the woven wick until the flame burned bright and distinctly hot within its glass chimney. She carefully unbuckled the heavy iron stirrups, draping the thick leather straps over the wooden stand to clear her access to the deep underside of the saddle. Holding the lantern by its wire handle, she directed the radiating heat upward toward the thick sheepskin lining. She was extremely careful not to let the open flame touch the wool. She only needed to simulate the immense, sustained body heat a galloping warhorse would generate over the course of the long solstice procession. Within moments, the treated leather began to react. The thick, waxy grease hidden deep within the wool fibers rose to the surface, glistening dangerously under the amber lantern light. The sharp, cloying scent of crushed hemlock and oleander rapidly filled the narrow room, pressing heavily against the back of her throat and making her eyes water. Maeve held her breath, refusing to inhale the toxic vapor. She took one square of the smooth, prepared pigskin scrap and pressed it firmly against the seeping, heated oil. She held the hide there for 10 seconds, then 20. She counted the passing time by the frantic, steady rhythm of her own pulse against her ribs, waiting for the chemical transfer to complete. A faint, sickening hiss broke the oppressive quiet of the tack room. Maeve immediately pulled the scrap away and held it near the lantern glass to inspect the damage. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and violently aggressive. The pale, porous tissue was already puckering, the smooth surface bubbling as the unseen compound systematically attacked the cellular structure. As she watched, the center of the contact patch turned a deep, bruised purple, and then rapidly blackened into a crumbling, necrotic rot that ate right through the upper layer of the hide. Her breath caught in her throat. She stared at the ruined skin, the sheer weight of the intended violence dropping through her chest like a stone through still water. The speed of the chemical degradation was absolute. Steward Alistair Finch's toxin was not designed to merely sedate or sicken the rider to force a political delay. Once King Gabriel mounted the horse and the leather warmed against the beast's back, the poison would absorb directly through the sovereign's ceremonial breeches. Within minutes of the ride, his nervous system would collapse entirely, leaving him dead in the saddle before the procession even reached the lower gates. The black, spreading rot across the stiff material in her hand was undeniable. Physical proof. The trap was perfectly set for tomorrow's dawn, and the execution required no weapon other than the king's own mount. When dawn finally broke over the Silver Keep, it arrived with the pale quality of cracking ice. The cobblestones were slick with frost, catching the weak light as the hierarchy assembled for the solstice ride. The breath of the gathered lords plumed upward in white clouds, arranged in strict circles of rank. At the center stood King Gabriel Vaughan, his posture unhurried and commanding. The dark wool of his riding cloak brushed the frost-rimmed stones. From the lower mews, Maeve Vance led Redoubter Vaughan into the open air. She did not use a punishing iron chain, only a simple, braided rope. Her knuckles were white from the biting cold, her breathing slow and measured to anchor the massive black stallion. Redoubt's iron-shod hooves struck the cobblestones with a rhythmic cadence that commanded immediate silence from the court. The kind that swallows words whole. The atmospheric pressure shifted when the master saddler approached, carrying the hemlock-oiled ceremonial saddle. The heavy leather had been kept near glowing braziers all morning to ensure the sovereign rode in warmth. The heat radiating from the tack carried the sweet-bitter trace of crushed botanical matter into the winter ozone. As the saddler lifted the equipment, Redoute did not rear up in blind panic. Instead, he pinned his ears flat, forming a sleek line of absolute aggression. He pivoted his massive frame, swinging a heavy hind leg outward to block the approach without striking. The man stumbled back, dropping the heavy leather onto a wooden block with a dull thud. Gabriel stepped forward, raising a gloved hand to signal the royal guard to hold. Moving with the deliberate calm of a man accustomed to volatile forces, the sovereign reached for the silver stirrup to inspect the tack himself. Before Gabriel's fingers could brush the cold metal, Redoute lunged. The stallion did not attack. With a calculated shift of immense weight, the horse threw his left shoulder into Gabriel's path, executing a flawless defensive block. His sheer mass forced the sovereign to step back. Redoute then lowered his massive head and snapped his jaws shut with a terrifying crack of enamel. He did not aim at the king. He aimed directly over the seat of the poisoned tack. Maeve stood firmly on the freezing stone. She did not shout commands, letting the violent vibration of the stallion's warning travel through the rope. The court gasped, interpreting the jaw snap as an assassination attempt by a rogue beast. They saw madness. Maeve saw a desperate physical barrier erected between the sovereign and the poisoned leather. Redoute snorted, his dark eyes locked entirely on the saddle, refusing to yield. The stunned silence shattered. A cacophony of alarmed shouts erupted from the nobles, the veneer of decorum dissolving into panicked outrage. The royal guardsmen tightened their grips on their heavy halberds, waiting for the inevitable order to strike the horse dead. Julian Thorne saw his perfect moment. The disgraced riding master stepped rapidly forward, his face flushed with the opportunistic heat of a man eager to reclaim his lost status. "The animal has gone rabid," Master Julian shouted over the chaotic assembly. "Stand aside, Your Grace." "I warned the council this brute would eventually turn on the crown." The harsh scrape of steel, leaving a scabbard, rang out. Master Julian drew his broadsword. He advanced on the Stallion with aggressive strides, raising the blade to bring it down in one lethal strike. Redoute tossed his head, his nostrils flaring. His weight shifted back, preparing to meet the armed assault with a lethal strike of his own iron-shod hooves. The tension in the lead rope spiked, the fibers groaning. Maeve did not calculate the severe political cost of defying a high-born lord before the king. She simply moved. Dropping the rope to give the horse his freedom, she stepped into the freezing space between the Stallion and the drawn sword. She did not raise her arms to fight. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her calloused hands resting loosely against her thighs. She placed her fragile frame as the only physical barrier between the executioner's military steel and the beast who had trusted her with his warnings. Master Julian froze mid-stride. His sword trembled in the cold air, suddenly faced with the prospect of murdering an unarmed, stable hand in full view of the sovereign. "Move, girl," he hissed, his eyes wide with fury and disbelief, "or I will strike you down for treason against the crown." Maeve held her ground on the frost-slicked stones, her posture absolute. Behind her, Redoute lowered his massive head until his velvet muzzle brushed against her shoulder, his breathing matching the fearless rhythm of her chest. Gabriel's voice cut through the freezing air, lower than a whisper, but carrying the absolute, crushing weight of the throne. "Sheathe the steel, Master Julian." The king had not moved from the wooden block. He was not looking at the panicked court, nor at the trembling riding master. His grey eyes were locked entirely on Maeve, analysing the precise geometry of her stance, the complete absence of hysteria in her expression, and the protective alignment of the war horse in her shadow. He recognised with sudden clarity that the invisible groom had just risked her life, not out of foolish sentiment, but because she knew something the entire court did not. Julian Thorne reluctantly lowered his broadsword, though the rest of the frozen courtyard remained perfectly still. The drawn swords of the royal guard caught the pale winter sunlight, their iron tips still pointed toward the towering black stallion, Redoute of Vaughan, and the small, dark-haired groom standing before him. Maeve Vance did not cower. She kept one hand pressed flat against the muscular crest of the animal's neck, feeling the rapid, thrumming vibration of his pulse beneath the thick winter coat. She did not look at the angry riding master, nor did she acknowledge the gasps of the assembled nobility. Her focus remained entirely on King Gabriel Vaughan. When she finally spoke, her voice lacked the trembling pitch of a terrified servant. It was low and raspy, textured by years of breathing cold, stable air, dry straw dust, and leather soap, yet it carried a precise, technical weight that demanded immediate attention. "He is not attacking you, Your Grace," Maeve said, her tone as measured as a ledger entry. "Look at his forelegs. He is throwing his shoulder outward, executing a calculated block to break your line of approach. Notice his ears. They are not pinned flat against his skull in aggression toward a rider. They are swiveled backward, tracking the immediate vicinity of his own girth. King Gabriel raised a single gloved hand. The gesture was silent, but the guards instantly lowered their blades an inch. He stepped forward, his expression unreadable, observing the stallion's rigid posture just as she directed. A warhorse of this lineage does not waste caloric energy on meaningless rebellion, Maeve continued, her breathing slow, and even to keep Redoubt grounded. He only expends this level of frantic, localized movement when he detects an immediate, lethal threat that his rider cannot perceive. He is not fighting the crown. He is fighting the tack. She shifted her gaze toward the heavy equipment resting on the wooden mounting block nearby. His olfactory receptors are vastly superior to ours. He is reacting to the chemical compositions stitched into the leather. The hemlock-oiled, ceremonial saddle is compromised. A ripple of offended murmurs swept through the High Council. The lords in their velvet cloaks exchanged glances of aristocratic disdain, insulted that a common stable hand was lecturing them on equine sensory mechanics. One of the councilmen scoffed aloud, calling it a desperate excuse for a poorly trained beast. Maeve did not raise her voice over their mockery. She simply maintained her eye contact with the sovereign. He is exhibiting asymmetrical breathing and a hollowed spine, she stated, listing the symptoms with the clinical detachment of a royal healer. These are the exact physiological markers of a prey animal confined near a high-concentration neurotoxin. He refused to let you mount because the saddle itself is poisoned. Gabriel studied her face. He did not ask for apologies, nor did he dismiss her technical assessment. He merely tilted his head toward the mounting block. "Prove it," the king commanded. Maeve gave a short, respectful nod. She stepped away from the stallion, leaving him ground-tied, and walked deliberately toward the wooden block where the condemned equipment rested. The heavy leather was stiff in the freezing air, its thick sheepskin lining pale and seemingly pristine. She turned to the nearest royal guardsman, a tall man holding a pitch-soaked iron torch to cut through the morning frost. "Bring the flame closer," she instructed. The guard hesitated, his eyes darting to the sovereign for permission. Gabriel gave a brief, subtle gesture of assent. The soldier stepped forward, lowering the crackling torch until the heat radiated directly over the inverted tack. "The toxin is dormant in the cold," Maeve explained to the watching court, her hands steady as she reached into the deep pocket of her canvas apron. "It requires friction and sustained warmth to activate. Once a rider is seated, the combined body heat of the mount and the man melts the suspension wax, allowing the poison to absorb directly through the skin." From her pocket, she retrieved the second square of the pigskin scrap she had prepared. It was a raw, untreated piece of flesh, highly porous and biologically similar to human skin in its absorption rate. She held it up so the High Lords, the Chancellor, and the Archon's entourage could see it clearly. The air around the mounting block began to shimmer. As the intense heat of the torch baked the sheepskin lining, the invisible waxy residue embedded deep within the wool began to liquefy. A sharp, bitter scent bloomed in the freezing courtyard, a distinct, metallic odor of crushed hemlock mixed with the sweet rot of oleander. Without hesitation, Maeve pressed the pigskin scrap firmly against the heated lining. The chemical reaction was violent and immediate. A foul, wet hiss cut through the absolute silence of the court. The pale scrap of skin darkened instantly, bubbling as the caustic neurotoxic oil destroyed its cellular structure. Noxious white smoke curled from the point of contact. Within seconds, the edges of the pigskin curled inward, turning a sickly, bruised black. Maeve lifted the ruined square by the corner, displaying the blistering decay to the council. If His Grace had ridden today, this reaction would occur against his inner thighs. The heart failure would have been sudden, massive, and entirely indistinguishable from a natural collapse. A collective wave of horror washed over the nobility. Men who had scoffed only moments ago now recoiled, pulling their cloaks tight against their bodies, as if the toxic smoke could reach them. King Gabriel stared at the blackened flesh, his jaw tightening into a hard, unforgiving line. The sheer mechanical brilliance of the assassination attempt hung in the air, undeniable and terrifying. The courtyard of the Silver Keep erupted into a fractured, chaotic murmur as the black blister on the test leather continued to smoke in the freezing air, sending the acrid stench of burning hemlock and charred pigskin rolling over the frost. Lords and ladies recoiled further in unison, terrified by the undeniable chemical reality exposed on the cobblestones. In the center of that rising panic, Steward Alistair Finch did not gasp. The steward did not cry out in protest or draw a hidden weapon. He simply stopped existing in the focal point of the court. With calculated, fluid precision, he let his shoulders drop, taking one smooth step backward to allow the shifting, terrified nobility to obscure his retreat. His soft leather boots made virtually no sound against the frost-heaved stones as he turned his narrow back toward the heavy iron-wrought archway of the northern gate. He meant to vanish into the morning mist before the royal guard could fully process the treason laid bare before them. Maeve Vance watched him move, her hyper-vigilant eyes tracking the unnatural stillness of his escape. She tightened her grip on the woven lead rope, her breath catching in the back of her throat, as she calculated the distance between the fleeing man and the armored soldiers standing blind at the perimeter. She opened her mouth to shout a warning, to break the quiet discipline that had kept her alive for so long, but she did not need to speak. Redoute of Vaughan had already read the geometry of the courtyard. The great black stallion did not rear in a display of primal rage. He did not issue a wild, dramatic challenge to the wind, nor did he lash out with his iron-shod hooves like a mindless beast reacting to human fear. Instead, he behaved as the highly trained tactical partner he was bred to be. He simply dropped his massive head, his dark ears pivoting backward to catch the precise, hurried rhythm of the traitor's retreating footsteps. Then the horse moved. It was not a frantic charge. It was a terrifying, deliberate displacement of mass. 17 hands of solid muscle and dense bone cut through the freezing air, separating the panicked crowd like a black ship parting dark water. The sheer physical presence of the warhorse, moving with silent, predatory intent, forced the nobility to scramble out of his path, their leather soles slipping on the icy stones. Alistair reached the deep shadows of the iron gate. His pale hand darted out to grasp the heavy iron latch that would secure his escape into the lower city. Redoute stepped sideways, moving with the tactical grace of a sovereign mount. The stallion pivoted on his hindquarters and swung his immense shoulder directly into the narrow gap between the fleeing steward and the exit. The impact was dull, heavy, and absolutely deliberate. Redoute pressed his enormous bulk against Alistair, trapping the man against the cold, biting stone of the archway. There was no aggressive biting. There was no frantic kicking. The horse merely leaned his weight forward, utilizing his structural advantage to perfection. He exhaled a long, rhythmic breath that plumed white in the winter air, pinning the traitor so tightly against the masonry that the man's ribs creaked audibly under the pressure. The royal guards, finally breaking free from their shock, rushed forward with drawn steel ringing against their breastplates. They did not have to fight to secure their prisoner. The steward was already immobilized, his face pale and slick with terror, held perfectly in place by the silent absolute judgment of the beast he had attempted to murder. With the treasonous steward firmly shackled in cold iron and dragged toward the lower dungeons, a profound stillness settled over the courtyard. The biting northern wind whipped at the silk banners above, but the assembled court remained frozen in place, their eyes locked on the low-status groom and the towering warhorse who had just rewritten the hierarchy of their world. King Gabriel Vaughan looked down at the smoking, ruined leather of the ceremonial saddle, then shifted his dark gaze to the quiet woman standing in the center of the frost-covered yard. He gestured for the remaining guards to sheathe their weapons. The sovereign did not shout his gratitude to the heavens, nor did he order immediate, bloody executions on the spot. He did not offer a grand, performative speech to the trembling nobles who had blindly followed protocol into a death trap. He simply allowed the undeniable weight of the morning's truth to settle over the keep like a heavy winter snowfall. Gabriel stepped forward, his heavy leather boots crunching softly against the ice, closing the distance between the throne and the stable dirt. He stopped a respectful distance from Maeve, protecting her boundaries even in the aftermath of chaos. His dark eyes took in the rough wool of her tunic, her ink-stained fingers that had spent the night poring over the supply ledgers, and the steady, unbroken line of her posture. She did not shrink away from his sovereign presence. She held her ground, her breathing slow and measured, matching the calm rhythm of the horse beside her. The king turned his head slightly toward his chancellor, holding out a gauntleted hand. The older man, pale and visibly shaking from the narrow avoidance of a royal assassination that would have fractured the realm, fumbled at his heavy belt. He unclipped a thick, forged iron key ring, the master set that unlocked every stall, archive, and tack room within the sovereign grounds, and placed it silently into the sovereign's waiting palm. From his own heavy winter cloak, Gabriel unfastened a small, polished silver equine pin, its surface deeply etched with the ancient crest of the royal muse. He turned back and offered them to her. It was not a gesture of charity, nor a temporary reward for a loyal servant, but the formal, structural recognition of an undeniable fact. "The position of riding master is vacant," King Gabriel said, his voice dropping into a low, steady register that carried only to her ears and the flicking ears of the black stallion. "I require a master of the sovereign muse who understands that the most crucial truths are rarely spoken aloud. I require someone who watches the shadows when the rest of the court is blinded by the light." Maeve reached out. She had spent her entire life learning how to shrink, how to take up as little space as possible in a world ruled by arrogant men. Now she did not tremble. The iron keys were freezing against her cracked, calloused palms, heavy with the weight of undisputed institutional authority. The silver pin caught the weak, grey winter light, a permanent marker of her chosen, belonging within the hierarchy of the keep. As her fingers closed tightly over the cold metal, sealing her new jurisdiction, a sudden, heavy weight dropped onto her shoulder. Redoute rested his massive chin against her collarbone. The stallion exhaled, a long, rumbling sigh of absolute contentment that vibrated deep through her chest. As he shifted his heavy jaw, he left a faint, damp smear of chewed sweetgrass against the coarse wool of her coat. She did not bow to the crowd. She simply nodded to the sovereign. The unspoken contract was permanently sealed in the bitter northern air, not with frantic declarations, but with the quiet, unbroken alignment of a king, a master of the muse, and the watchful beast who knew the true measure of them both. Tomorrow she would walk into the stables not as a ghost, but as a sovereign authority. She would sweep the corridors, check the feed ledgers, and read the silent shifts in the wind, knowing her quiet endurance had finally forged an undeniable, permanent sanctuary.